This story is not mine. The author will be in the description. Midoriya would later move his nightly adventures from random alleyways to spending it in the laboratories in Kurogiri's bar. It seemed like Shigaraki was always there waiting for him, but he never said much. And during the first few nights, there wasn't anything for the villain in the making to do. There was nobody to practice with, and he debated if that was a good or bad thing. It gave him more time to look over all the tools and drugs and study them. With books to read and the internet at his fingertips, it was good preparation to figure out what he was going to be doing soon enough. And while he never interacted with Shigaraki, Kurogiri made many appearances. The first time gave Midoriya quite a fright, as the dark fog man had teleported beside him, looking over his shoulder while he was at a desk reading a book. "Is everything useful?" the man had asked calmly, but it had scared the freckled teenager, causing him to jump and grab a syringe, holding it defensively with quivering hands. Kurogiri was shockingly polite. "Apologies for scaring you. You must have been focused," he apologized. Midoriya put the needle down with an embarrassed expression and quietly looked back at the book. "I've only dabbled in this kind of stuff. It's a bit overwhelming, I guess," he mumbled. Maybe he was way in over his head. He was just a teenager. He couldn't become a pro doctor for a single break and final season. There was so much to learn, memorize, and understand. This was nothing like hero notes, because now it was up to his own actions instead of gushing over others. But he suddenly panicked. "That doesn't mean that I'm going to ditch it all. Not after Shigaraki gave this all to me," he said, waving his hands at the man in the suit. He couldn't even risk looking like he was going to back out of this villain work now. They would probably kill him because of what he knew already. Don't let them get the wrong idea. He could do this. He told Shigaraki he would. And though he was expecting a threat from this man shrouded in darkness, he received a foggy hand on his shoulder instead. The gesture caused him to flinch, but then look up with less anxiety in his system. "I don't know much about this work either. I've never considered a medical field," he began, turning his head to look at the page the boy had opened on his desk. "It already looks very complicated. But if you truly need help, I wouldn't mind assisting you or finding someone who can." Midoriya could only blink a few times as Kurogiri began looking more closely at the book. "Shigaraki was telling me how he wanted to give you a subject right away. But I convinced him to let you build your confidence first. And in hindsight, I believe I made the correct decision. There were so many words even this grown adult couldn't understand. All these medical terms and body parts he's never heard of. It came off as intimidating to him. He found it a bit admirable that a child was stepping up to the challenge of comprehending it all. Would you like anything to help you focus? You've been down here for quite some time." He then offered before removing his hand from Midoriya's shoulder. Midoriya scratched the back of his head. "Maybe some water?" he asked shyly. It was then he watched Kurogiri disappear within himself as a portal for just a few moments. "Dark fog teleportation," he muttered out loud, still being his little habit. And before even a minute had passed, Kurogiri had returned with a glass of water and set it down on the desk. For villains, this guy didn't seem all that bad or scary now. It made the new villain smile. "Thank you." It became a ritual for a while for Kurogiri to come by the laboratories and offer food or a drink for the boy hard at work. And that boy's requests became more casual as he asked for sugary and salty snacks, fruit juices and sodas, finally getting comfortable in this new setting. At some points in the night, Midoriya would ask Kurogiri to stay for some company. There would be no talking or requests. The man would just stand there, sit at a different desk, or sometimes pick up a different book and try getting a few peeks at what the child was learning. And that child has never had a figure like this in his life before. An adult male figure that wouldn't tell him what he could or couldn't do, someone that was supporting him even if it was quiet, and someone that was letting him learn at his own pace. Interactions with Shigaraki were always brief if they weren't non-existent. He saw him when he arrived near midnight, and when he left around 6 am. He was always at the bar, in the same seat every time. Sometimes the counter would be covered in scattered papers, other times he was playing video games on a little TV, or be on a laptop going through odd-looking web pages, or watching the news, or on his phone, or sometimes he would just sit there with his palm on his cheek, It seemed like he never slept or he was nocturnal. He was really skinny too, so he didn't seem all that threatening until he used his quirk. But he always had that severed hand on his face. Something about that hand just seemed so strange. Does he ever take it off? Is it real? Does it do anything? Midoriya asked Kurogiri as they stood in the elevator going back up to the hub of the bar. He hugged 2 books in his arms, prepared to just take them home to continue studying diligently. Now he was more than comfortable with this dark fog man. It was the one who brought him into this villain world that seemed more the stranger. You could always ask him yourself, Kurogiri suggested, making Midoriya shake his head vigorously. If it was real, those would be very rude questions to ask. He didn't know Shigaraki well and it felt out of place to ask someone that he was working for something along those lines. Not a chance. I don't know him like that. I think he might kill me. If he's your boss, wouldn't you think it would be easier for you to get to know him? Avoiding him won't get either of you anywhere. Kurogiri suggested. Midoriya hid his nose behind the books and looked at his feet. Get to know his boss? Have his boss get to know him? What would they tell each other? Their goals seemed so vague and their inspirations were unclear to each other. Midoriya hasn't told anyone about his dreams in full. But when it came down to it, he wanted revenge on All Might, to prove himself, and to save Todoroki. But would that be enough for Shigaraki? I would also like to know you more. I could provide more helpful assistance. Kurogiri then added, having not received an answer in over a minute. It made Midoriya's head perk up slightly. Maybe, just maybe they would help him save that beautiful boy at the middle school. The elevator doors opened and Shigaraki was sitting right where he always was. On this particular morning, he was playing a video game on a little TV that sat on the counter. It looked like a single-player game. That fact alone was enough to ruin any source of courage to approach him. He didn't seem like the social type even though he was the one that approached Midoriya in the first place. But Kurogiri gave Midoriya the slightest nudge forward as he himself went behind the bar counter to start cleaning behind it. He liked to keep things tidy. Out of all the stools to choose from, Midoriya sat on the one on Shigaraki's right side. But he awkwardly sat there in silence, not knowing what to say, what to do, or even what to think. He had many questions to ask him and wanted to know so many things, and yet it felt inappropriate to ask. What was the hand? What were his motivations? What were his plans? How many people has he killed? How did he and Kurogiri meet? Did he live here? How old was he? Did he have a family? Did he have friends? Did he have other people working for him? Why did he give him a chance? Do you feel confident enough to have your first subject? Shigaraki asked out of nowhere, but ever so casually. The question made all of Midoriya's anxious questioning thoughts disperse and focus on how to answer. Was it worth lying? He looked to Kurogiri and internally told himself it wasn't worth lying. Honesty was the best way to build a positive relationship. I don't know. I've never done this kind of stuff before. He answered honestly and began playing with his fingers. I promise that I'm not chickening out. I just want to do it right. He had yet to kill someone. He wasn't as used to this as Shigaraki must have been by now. He killed that hero without a second glance. I've never killed someone, he admitted, almost afraid of what his boss's response would be. Why wasn't he saying anything? But you want to, right? Shigaraki then said after about a minute of painful silence. Midoriya stiffened even though the red-eyed man didn't seem all that angry or offended. Why yeah. Of course, I do. Please don't get the wrong idea. He wasn't running away from this. He wasn't a coward. That Endeavor guy, I remember you had a grudge. Why? Shigaraki then asked, keeping his eyes on the game he was playing. This conversation started with Midoriya wanting to know more about his boss, but somehow it seemed like it was only going the other way around. And Midoriya knew Shigaraki was getting him to spill more details about himself. However, he was not opposed to it. This was a give and take, and he was taking a lot of resources from the guy sitting next to him when considering the lab and study material. He could at least return it with information now. He lowered his head and stared at his feet, remembering how, at one point, there wasn't a floor in front of them. Someone Someone is suffering because of him. And that person did so much for me. I want to give back, he mumbled. So you're doing this for someone else? Shigaraki asked quickly. Not good. Not necessarily. I have my own issues with All Might and all his lies. He's not a real hero. He's just like everyone else. Someone like that shouldn't have that much influence. There was more than one motivation. He would be loyal, that is for certain. Figured out that heroes don't always come, huh? Shigaraki mumbled, lightly scratching at his neck while the screen on the game cut to a loading scene. It made Midoriya take notice and finally look at him. His eyes were calm but his body language expressed stress and intensity. Don't you think people are weaker when they rely on heroes? And they are so picky. I hate them. So much hate. The red hues of his eyes screamed nothing but hatred. So much hate. They get so lazy thinking heroes will take care of the world's problems. So it's not their problem anymore. They get so weak and stupid and they don't know or care what happens when a hero doesn't come. Not until it's too late. Midoriya listened as he watched the neck scratching become more intense. There were wounds there that weren't done healing yet. He was beginning to bleed a little bit as the skin was ripping. And yet violence is only okay when heroes use it. That's not fair, wouldn't you agree? It's annoying. I hate it. Shigaraki slowly began to stop the scratching as the game continued and both his hands were drawn to the controller again. Midoriya only stared at him for another minute full of silence, trying to piece together all that he's heard. Heroes don't always come. No hero came when he was being bullied. No hero came to tell him that he could succeed. No hero came to take him off the roof. Some random kid his age did. That kid was a different kind of hero. And all that hate. He felt it too. He hated All Might. He hated Endeavor. He hated all the heroes that would never give him a chance. He hated that hero society made him destined to be weaker than everyone born with a quirk. Then the bit about violence. A hero has tackled him to the dirt but the moment he fought back, he was in the wrong. The thought of all these things filled him with a kind of fire that made his fists clench up tightly. That person you. Who are they? Shigaraki then asked, seeming to have suddenly calmed down. He had a short temper but also a short cooldown. How scary. He could snap in a moment's notice. I never got his name. But he's around my age. He saved me from maybe he shouldn't tell that much. He saved me. He didn't finish his initial statement and yet Shigaraki did not question him about it. Instead, a little smirk peeked out from under the hand on his face. A crush? He suddenly teased. Just the mention of that sent Midoriya into a full blush and he slammed his hands on the table hastily. No. I barely know him. He talked to him for like an hour. It couldn't be something as juvenile as a crush. But you're willing to kill the number 2 hero for him. Shigaraki turned his head to place his chin in his palm and just got on all of Midoriya's nerves, even pointing at him casually. He was so immature. He must be a pretty big deal to you. Look at you. You're all embarrassed, little schoolboy. Shigaraki just ended up laughing at the poor teenager who just sat there and took it. He couldn't escape any form of bullying. But this kind didn't feel so bad. It felt fake. It was a tease, but just a tease. Whether he meant it or not, Midoriya didn't feel degraded. It's not like that. He childishly bit the inside of his cheek in a pout. It's like, when you feel like everything is ruined and have nowhere to go and it couldn't possibly get better. But someone gives that one little thing to keep you going. Does that make sense? He did his best to explain while clutching the fabric of his pants at his knees. When he finally looked at Shigaraki again, he would find him almost completely still and the game paused. The controller was still in his hands as he was staring down at it with narrowed eyes. He was quiet again. Midoriya tilted his head at him attempting to see more of his face behind the hand to no avail. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, he breathed at last. Midoriya listened carefully to Shigaraki's tone. It was the sound of someone that knew exactly what he was talking about. There was much more to this scrawny gamer than he could imagine. And so the two sat in silence for about a minute before Midoriya yawned and rubbed his eyes with the balls of his palms. Being busy all afternoon, evening, and night studying only gave him mornings to sleep and it was just barely daybreak now. He got off the stool with his things and put his hood over his head. "See you tomorrow," he mumbled before going out the door back home. The next night involved more studying, as did the night after, and the night after that. And after every night, he made it a habit to sit next to Shigaraki and talk with him a bit, now with Kurogiri always being close by. It reached a point where Shigaraki had once offered Midoriya a second game controller to play with him instead of just watching. Conversations would dwell away from work and villain stuff and shift more towards gaming and more normal conversations. Whether it be getting into a subtle rant about difficulty spikes, glitches, or inconvenient mechanics, or going on about how society sucked, heroes sucked, teenagers sucked, or people in general sucked, the two easily formed a kind of chemistry. Midoriya still worked for Shigaraki, but it was starting to feel less and less like a boss and minion relationship. And yet it didn't feel like a teacher and mentor connection either. All Might is going to be teaching at UA this year, Shigaraki began to say as he played an adventure game with Midoriya, who had gotten the hold of the gameplay and controls by now. "You start high school in a little while, don't you?" His attention shifted from the screen to the green-haired teenager beside him, and yet he was playing masterfully without looking at what he was doing. And beside him, Midoriya sat in all black clothing, as usual, but now with little dark circles beginning to form under and around his eyes. He looked to be in a constant state of tiredness these days. "Yeah. I applied to a few places. The results are supposed to come in later this week. And it was too late to take an application back. I did apply for UA." He looked annoyed and frustrated with himself. Going to such a school seemed sickening to him now. Being surrounded by arrogant kids with crazy quirks and selfish drives just sounded like an actual nightmare now. He grumbled and scratched at his head. "I was so stupid. I shouldn't have done that." "Well, if you do get in, it would be pretty helpful actually," Shigaraki said, and then reached over to pull Midoriya's wrist away from his head. He was picking up on his bad habits. He's also lost some weight since coming to the bar every night to study, ignoring his nutrition for knowledge. The teenager blinked when he heard Shigaraki speak again. "Having someone on the inside of a massive school like that would save me a lot of trouble. Just think a little." Shigaraki tapped Midoriya's forehead with one finger. "Having someone on the inside of All Might's place of work. A school with high-tech security, not knowing that a villain was walking inside its very walls. He could take notes on all the pro-hero teachers. He could get information on all the students. He could map out the school more accurately. I'd be right under our enemies' noses." He mumbled with a finger curled to his chin. "The paranoia of an intruder. No one would suspect me." A small smirk was tugging at the corner of his lips. "The heroes and the students would be in the palm of my hand." How amazing that sounded. To have the heroes scrambling because of him. However, you would still need to be careful. You can't give yourself away. You'll have to play nice with all the other kids and play along with their little games. Shigaraki reminded him. That did not sound amazing. It sounded agonizing. Getting along with pompous heroes on a daily basis was something he had no desire to do. You'll have to bite your tongue, put on a smile, and use that face of yours to make them all think you're just a little fanboy. Midoriya got physically paler as he put his face on the counter a bit harshly and made a small bang. He'd rather bash his head into the wall. Multiple times. But was it truly worth it? He'd be like a little rat amongst giant monsters. And yet the idea of the massive All Might dying at his feet, realizing it was the kid he underestimated that brought him to his demise, filled him with nothing but joy. Could he pretend to be the person he used to be? I don't know if Midoriya began to lift his head up off the counter when he saw the severed hand on the counter beside him. His eyes flickered when he noticed it and his focus quickly trailed up to Shigaraki's face. The skin around his eyes was wrinkled, dried, chipped, and cut. His lips were beyond being just chapped, and yet he had a scar on his right eye and at the corner of his mouth. No regular lotion or chapstick was going to make his face look normal. A condition maybe? Or maybe something with his quirk caused him to look so terrifyingly strange. And yet it was something about his eyes that Midoriya found alluring. They had looked so narrow and angry all the time when they were behind the severed hand's fingers. But now they seemed just a little bit softer, a little bit bigger, and a little bit brighter. Think you can do it? Shigaraki asked, looking down at him. Midoriya could only bring himself to nod. Was this his way of showing trust? He had this overwhelming feeling well up in his chest when they made eye contact. The expression in those red eyes was telling him so many things that he couldn't begin to understand. I think you can too. Shigaraki didn't put the hand back on after their short conversation. Perhaps he just felt more comfortable without it now. At least with Midoriya. And so they played a video game for a little bit longer like this. Hey, do you think the son of the number 2 hero would go to the UA? Midoriya asked, the thought suddenly coming to his mind. Would he see that boy again? Would he be there as a hero in training? Would they become enemies? I would assume so. I bet that wouldn't even have to take the tests to get in. Shigaraki answered honestly. The answer made Midoriya hold the controller close to his chest and lower his head a bit. A villain and a hero. It wouldn't possibly work. Todoroki wanted to be a hero. Granted, a hero that had pure motivations. But there's no way he would approve of the work Midoriya was planning to do. Would they fight? What would he do if they did meet again? Would he have to fake his personality to him? He wanted to save him. He was doing this for himself but also for the boy that saved him. Do you think he'd be willing to join us? Shigaraki asked, watching Midoriya from the corner of his eye. The question made Midoriya raise his head a bit with wide eyes. Join them? Turning that beautiful, pure boy into a villain? But they could fight the world together. He could save him and do it honestly. He could show him how he changed him with his words. Maybe he would. You would love to have him. He's got an amazing quirk. He holds a small grudge against heroes too. He's got to be super strong but would it be that easy? Midoriya paused when he saw Shigaraki lean over the counter with his fingers to his lips, thinking intensely. You'll need help persuading someone like that. He still wants to be a hero, doesn't he? It can't be that easy. It won't be that easy. Someone as pure-hearted as that can't be so willing to join people like them. If you have faith that he can come to us, then let me know if I can get something as a means of persuasion. Like blackmail. Not necessarily. Like if there's something he wants more than anything that he couldn't get by being who he is now. Something that the heroes would never be able to give him. Though I suppose blackmail could work too if. I don't wanna do that. Midoriya was not going to let Todoroki be blackmailed. But bribed, maybe he would succumb to that, although deep down he hoped he wasn't that shallow. He'd have to learn more about him. He'd have to learn his deepest desires, his most far-off dreams, his most desperate wishes. Someone like Todoroki, that beautiful boy that gave him hope and purpose again, wouldn't be so easily moved by material goods. But the fact that Shigaraki was willing to help him, even if it was for selfish reasons or not, he was grateful. Midoriya soon yawned and rubbed his tired eyes. It wasn't the usual time for him to leave yet, but he still felt so exhausted. He wanted to stay here just a little bit longer. He wanted to spend more time with Shigaraki. He wanted to enjoy Kurogiri's company more. He wanted to tell them all about Todoroki. His dreams felt real when he was here with these two villains. He didn't notice himself starting to doze off as his fantasized dreams and actual dreams were beginning to blend together. Going in and out of sleep while sitting up on the stool was something he began to struggle with all of a sudden. Shigaraki felt a weight leaning against his arm only to notice a teenager was fast asleep against him, the controller still in his grip. He couldn't help but freeze up a bit and maybe even mentally panic because now he was stuck. But it was then he felt a strange feeling in his chest and it was terribly painful, although the pain wasn't physical. His own hands began to tremble slightly as when he looked from the corner of his eyes, he only saw black hair and pigtails on the person against him. But when actually turned to look, it was a green fluffy mess of hair instead. He must have been getting tired too, seeing such strange things. You like him, don't you? Kurogiri broke the silence as he reached over to take the controller out of Midoriya's hands and set it on the counter so he wouldn't drop it and wake himself up. Though he was sure to keep his voice quiet to not wake the sleeping boy. Shigaraki only stared at the freckled face that was squished against his arm. This boy was looking so tired lately, studying so hard so that he could be of the utmost use when he was ready to take the next step. He was working so hard. And he was working so hard for him, for this boy he kept telling him about, and for himself. Shigaraki hated so many things, hated so many people. But there was no hatred towards this little sleeping boy. Maybe, he answered at last. Maybe the exact opposite of hatred. Well, I liked him, Kurogiri said bluntly. Well, that's a bit odd for you. Last I remember, you hated kids. Shigaraki grumbled with a hint of salt behind his words. It made the dark fog man's eyes narrow, but not in anger or spite. A simple expression of thought was all he was portraying. That was a while ago. But I almost pity this one. But with how determined he is, I find myself wanting to watch him grow. I'm curious about what will become of him. Kurogiri turned his back to Shigaraki as he began organizing bottles that were already neatly placed on shelves against the wall. The skinny villain could only scoff at how much of a neat freak he was. I'm also curious about what he can do to this boy he thinks so highly of. The son of Endeavor would be a powerful asset to you. However, his morals and philosophies are but a mystery to us all. Kurogiri continued. By now, Shigaraki was no longer paying any mind to his game, but simply watching Midoriya sleep so soundly against his arm. What was this boy truly capable of? What would happen if something went wrong? Was he willing to leave Midoriya behind? Above all, I look forward to seeing you work with him and his motivations. He looks up to you now. I'm aware that something like this is very new for you. Kurogiri's eyes angled in a way that represented a smirk on his mouthless face. Clearly you trust him, taking your dear father off like so. I admit you've surprised me with that. And now I have to wonder, Shigaraki Tomura, are you getting attached? The man turned around to see Shigaraki had put an arm around Midoriya to keep him up against his side and to prevent him from falling over. He was almost hypnotized by his own actions, simply feeling the need to keep the sleeping boy like this. Safe. Comfortable. Trusted. Kurogiri made a short chuckle at the sight he was beholding and merely shrugged it off. Dear friend, what were you thinking with this one? He said softly to himself. When Midoriya woke up just before noon, he found himself in a bed that was not his own, though he was very comfortable. He sat up and rubbed his dark eyes, looking around to figure out where he had been taken to. An empty, undecorated, and slightly dusty bedroom was where he found himself. There was an open door that gave him the view of a type of apartment-like place. Out the window, he could see he was still in the same location as the bar, but higher up. So the second floor was living spaces? You can stay here if you want, you know. Shigaraki's voice came from the corner of the room where a single table was placed. There wasn't even a chair. He was sitting on top of it with no hand blocking his face. You take pretty long walks going from home to here every night. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. Midoriya rubbed his face to attempt to wake himself up more and comprehend what Shigaraki was telling him. He just woke up and now he was being told he could live here. He needed a second to process things. Are you sure that's okay? He groaned. He's supposed to be working for Shigaraki and he felt like he was being spoiled with the laboratories, the time to study, and now a new living space. It'll make you more efficient, wouldn't it? Shigaraki asked back. You get your first corpse tonight. So I need you in the best condition to focus on what you can learn. He got up from the table and went to the doorway and leaned against the frame, folding his arms casually. It's empty right now, but you can have this be your little apartment. I can give you some cash or Kurogiri could snag anything you want for it. So like, he paused and scratched at his neck slightly. Make yourself at home, I guess. Midoriya stared at Shigaraki as the latter avoided eye contact by staring off at a wall and in general emitting an awkward vibe. Despite how creepy and friendly he was in their first meeting, it turns out that his boss was a socially awkward hermit after all. Midoriya almost found it funny but he didn't want to make fun of him. And the taller young man began to walk out and leave when the freckled villain raised his hand out straight. Wait a second, he called out when the other's back was turned. I forgot. I never got to thank you for saving me from that hero that night. And now you gave me all of this so, with sleepy eyes and a sleepy smile, Midoriya scratched his cheek with one finger awkwardly. Thank you, Tomu. Hearing this, Shigaraki lost all color to his skin and his eyes seemed to lose all life as his soul completely left his body. He looked like a standing corpse. That stupid little nickname killed him. It was so stupid. It was cripplingly embarrassing. Why the hell did he feel the need to call him that? He was left completely speechless as all his weight pressed against the doorframe. He died. Temporarily. He wanted to be the worst villain in the world and take down the strongest hero, but he was the embodiment of social anxiety. Midoriya watched Shigaraki slowly dragged his feet out of the room and silently left like a zombie. The teenager couldn't help but snicker at the fact Shigaraki got so embarrassed that he broke with just a nickname. Bakugo didn't react like that at all when he was given the nickname Kaken. Bakugo was just pissed. He just unintentionally traumatized a murderer. Midoriya found out very quickly that Kurogiri was a god of a cook when he came down to the bar for breakfast lunch. Whether it was a snack or a full meal, he could make anything taste amazing. Though when he came to eat a full meal, Shigaraki was in his usual seat eating a single bag of chips. He sparked a bit of curiosity within him. Tomu, are you skinny because you don't eat, or is it your quirk? He asked. Shigaraki flinched with death as his soul peaced out for a good few seconds before he regained half of his composure. It made Kurogiri chuckle quietly to himself as this child has learned how to mentally kill this blue-haired young man. Both. Healthy food is gross and my body breaks stuff down really fast. He answered casually only for Midoriya to whip out a notepad from his pocket and rapidly take quick notes. Don't take notes on me. He felt like he was being added to the hit list. But I have to. If something happens to you, I have to know the best way to fix you. So I need to know how you work. Midoriya answered and it made the older villain blush for a moment before looking away and going on his phone. Whatever. His reaction made the teenager giggle to himself. How was he ever scared of this guy in the first place? He was so easy to tease. At least I'm not head over heels for someone I don't even know their name to, he sneered, making Midoriya go bright red instantly. He was so petty. I told you I don't have a crush on him. Midoriya whined. Kurogiri watched the two go back and forth childishly and could only sigh at their foolish teases. Like siblings. I very much hope you enjoyed. Sorry for not posting yesterday and the day before I was busy. Anygays, a reminder the art and book are not mine, author is in description. As the meme gods always say, be gay and do crime. Storyteller signing off.